Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Becca Jablonski, who's faculty at Cornell University and works on local and regional foods. Becca, thank you so much for being here. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenny. It's great to be here. So as you mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. I've worked on local and regional food systems for many years now. And in addition, I teach farm business management and agricultural finance for Cornell.
Perfect. Well, can we start off by just defining local and regional foods? What does this mean?
So good question. So there is no actual definition for local and regional food systems. So individual programs define it for themselves. The federal government does not have a specific definition. They do for certain programs, but it's not sort of a universal definition like we have for something like organic. And actually, there's been some interesting research by Zoe Plakius, for example, that looks at the impacts of how you define local and regional food systems and, for example, how that impacts farm to school purchasing.
Yeah. So is there anything common to people's definitions?
So I would say there's 400 miles or within the same state is what exists for some of the federal programs. And that's probably the most commonly used. I believe in that study, or if you look at something like the farm to school census and think about those definitions, it's like county, multi-county region within the same state, or that 400 miles. I do a lot of work in New York State, as you might imagine. And even for a place like New York City, that's right next to New Jersey, right? Much closer to New Jersey farms than some of the farms in the western part of New York. Their definition actually has to be the state of New York for local.
Okay. So local-ish. Got it. And now it's weird asking about how long this has been around because this is how things used to be, right? So if we talk about sort of the modern local foods movement, could you sort of walk us through how long that's been going on?
Yeah, so it's hard to give you specific information in the sense that there have been places where we've collected data, and so we have better information on that. So, when people think about local foods, they often think about like direct to consumer markets. So, for example, farmers markets. And so actually the federal government's been collecting information on farmers markets, sales through farmers markets, the number of farmers markets for decades. And so we actually have some decent information on that.
Okay.
But what we know actually is that those direct to consumer markets or farmers market sales actually represent a pretty small portion of total local food sales. So my point in saying this is that I think there are a number of places where we've had local food markets that have probably been actually of decent size. We just don't necessarily have the data to back that up. But to give you a sense, as an example, I remember going to the first meeting of the food hubs, right? Which is, if you're not familiar with food hubs, these are essentially aggregation and distribution businesses that have sort of a value or a business mandate to work with local and oftentimes small and mid-scale farms. And I believe that first convening that I went to was in like 2007 or 2008. Another way to measure this would be to look at the expansion of some of the policies that have existed mostly through the Farm Bill, the Farmers Market Promotion Program that's been around for decades. So if we think about sort of the birth and growth of local and regional food markets from more of a federal policy perspective, you actually had the Farmer to Consumer Direct Marketing Act that happened in 1976, right? So thinking about the role of farmers markets really is I would say, community engagement type of strategy, right? And then in 1992, you had the WIC, Farmers Market Nutrition Program, Child Nutrition Act. You had the community food projects came into the Farm Bill. When we had in 2002, you had a Farm Bill focus on infrastructure and development, right? So that I think helps to think moving past those direct to consumer markets and the role of actually having some of that middle supply chain infrastructure that is, I'm going to say, appropriately scaled to help especially small and mid-scale farms to access more of these intermediated markets. In the 2008 Farm Bill, there were now direct supports and geographic preference allowance, right? That was a really important change that was made to increase the availability of local foods or the provision of local foods, for example, through schools. And then I think what happened that really helped to spur some of the growth of this was under Kathleen Merrigan, who was the deputy undersecretary under Secretary Vilsack in the Obama administration. And in 2009, they launched the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative. Now, importantly, through that initiative, there was actually no new resources provided to support local and regional food markets. But what it did was it said, okay, we're going to take people across the U.S. Department of Agriculture that are working in all of these different spaces, and we're going to require one person from each of these different agencies to come together to meetings to think about how do we more effectively leverage the resources of the Department of Agriculture to support local and regional food systems.
Yeah.
And Jenny, maybe one reason just to say why they did this, because I think that's really important. Like, why do we care about local foods is a question that comes up a lot. And I think the idea here is that there's growing recognition that there's been consolidation in really every aspect of the food system. And even though the research on what the impacts of that, like do we actually have market failures that exist, right, basically say no, and we don't, that the place where there is some questionable implications is really in the impacts of small farms, right?
Yeah.
That small farms may have reduced access to markets as a result of some of that consolidation, right? And certainly we know what's true is that small and mid-scale producers on average have higher per unit costs of production relative to larger operations, right? That's true across all commodities. And so as a result, they need to be able to access differentiated markets where they can get some kind of premium for those products, right? And so I think that was really the idea around the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, supporting small and mid-scale farms, opportunities to support community economic development. We also have a literature that talks about the importance of local ownership, right? To think about some of those spillover effects to local communities and economies. And that local and regional food markets also could support beginning farmers, right? That also maybe were operating at smaller scales and needed better access to these differentiated markets. So once the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative really took off, we could see that there's actually changes that took place. Again, not because there were additional resources, but because existing resources were sort of better leveraged to support these kinds of markets. And then we continued to see subsequent changes in the Farm Bill, including mandatory appropriations under some of these programs.
And I guess, so it's not just farmers markets. It's not just direct to consumer. You talked about food hubs. I mean, there's also some wholesale and resale and institutional sales to schools and other institutions. Could you describe that space a little bit more?
Yes. So again, part of this and how I'm going to talk about it has to do with how we collect the data. So at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, they tend to lump local and regional food markets into two different categories. So one is direct-to-consumer markets, and the other is called intermediated markets. Now, over the past two censuses, there's actually been more detailed questions that have been asked, and so we can get better information. We've also had something called a local food marketing practice data. The majority of local food sales are through intermediated markets. So with the most recent data that we have available from 2022, the total size of the local food sector was $17.5 billion, of which $14.2 billion were through intermediated markets. So the data on intermediated markets is really in three different spaces that we ask questions about. One is sales to retailers. Another is sales to intermediaries. So that would include food hubs, but other kinds of distributors as well. And then the third kind is sales to institutions. But actually, because almost no food moves directly from farm to institution, most of it goes through those intermediaries. So we actually see almost no sales in that institutional category. It's not because they're not local food sales that are there, but because that's not how farms would necessarily recognize where they're selling the product.
How would you characterize the size or the market share of these different channels?
Great. So as I mentioned, there's $17.5 billion that's going through local food markets in total, of which $14.2 billion are through intermediated channels. And within those intermediated channels, we see about half of it. So $7.1 billion is going to retail, and almost $7 billion, $6.9 billion went through intermediated markets. Then we also can look at different types of direct-to-consumer sales as well. Again, that's a very small portion of total local food sales. And interestingly, if you look at the national picture, the number of farms with direct-to-consumer sales is actually declining and sales have stalled. Now, it's not true when you look at individual states. So, for example, in New York, we saw that direct to consumer markets actually increased from 2017 to 2022, but that's not true if we look at that national picture. And then one other thing to mention is in terms of the number of operations. So, we have roughly about 155,000 farms that are selling through these local food markets, of which about 116,000 farms are selling through direct markets, and about 60,000 are selling through intermediated markets. So those numbers aren't mutually exclusive, right? We have farms that are selling through both. So the sort of takeaway picture here is that we have way more farms that are selling through local food markets that are selling through direct to consumer markets, smaller portions selling through intermediated markets, but the intermediated markets are where we have far more sales.
That's 5 to 10% of farms as defined by the USDA. And then of the 17.5 billion, that's probably a smaller share of, I don't know what the comparable food market would be.
Last time I looked, I remember hearing that it's, larger than cotton, for example. But we could look that up and do some more digging if you want.
Yeah. Yeah. No. That's
I
that.
think the key point is that, this is not, if you're trying to compare this market to certain kinds of commodities like
Mhm.
corn or
Yeah.
soy, right? It's not going to compare. The question is, the extent to which these markets provide opportunities for
Yep.
farmers that maybe wouldn't otherwise be able to
Right.
compete, like those small and mid-scale farms,
Yep.
like those
Yep.
beginning operations, veteran operations, right? And if they have these sort of spillover community benefits.
Right. Absolutely. I want to dig into that, but I think you've touched on some of the policies. And I know the sort of the share of funds in the Farm Bill going to local foods has grown over time. You want to talk about what the top 2 or 3 or 4 policies are? I know you mentioned a few, but what's really important? What do you think people should be aware of?
Well, so there's many programs that have set-asides, right? And those set-asides could be, for example, for beginning farms or mid-supply chain infrastructure. I would say the
Okay.
primary programs are a suite of programs called LAMP, which is the Local Agricultural Marketing Program. Of those programs, most of them are administered by the USDA Ag Marketing Service. One is administered by USDA Rural Development, which is the Value Added Producer Grant. But we have things like this is the Local Foods Promotion Program. So that's that intermediated infrastructure. We have the Farmers Market Promotion Program. That's the one that's existed for so many years, since I think 1976. And then we have a Regional Food System Partnership Program. There were also some additional significant investments made through some of these pandemic era programs.
Yeah.
Some of those have now been canceled, but some still exist. So, for example, like we had Regional Food System Infrastructure, RFSI. Those were mid-supply chain infrastructure investments. Each state was allocated funding for those. So those investments have been made or being rolled out at something called the Regional Food Business Centers. And that was a $400 million investment, as was the Resilient Food System Infrastructure. The regional regional food business centers have actually now their funding is ending, but they gave out these business builder grants. So all of that's happening, but also there is significant spending happening by states. So, for example, the National School Lunch Program is our second largest welfare feeding program in the United States, right after the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And if you think about the National School Lunch Program, when we had this change that I mentioned earlier, where we actually are allowed to have local preferencing, we have a number of states that have provided some really significant investments to try to increase local food purchasing by schools. Just as an example, I'm working with the state of California, invested $100 million in incentives to support farm to school purchasing in their state. In New York, we have something called the 30% New York State Initiative, where instead of having this 5 or 6 cents that's provided to schools, they actually increase that in terms of the state amount to New York State provides a significant premium. I think it's from 5 cents to 25 cents about per meal. Once states hit 30% of all of the National School Lunch Program food that's being served is coming from New York State sources. So they have to hit that in 1 year, and then the following year they get that incentive. So there are these significant incentives that are happening not just at the federal level, but also at state and local levels.
You can get some share of the way by the milk in New York.
Right. But that happens if you want to
That
think of
has
it
to
that way.
help. Okay, that's so it sounds like it's more provision of public goods, building up markets. There's some direct grants for infrastructure and marketing, and then there's these incentives for purchasing local or regional foods. Does that sort of summarize the what's happening?
Yes. So the majority of the programs that are available are not direct subsidies to
Yep.
producers, but they're
Yep.
more to facilitate market access or to build the requisite infrastructure that helps to move product from farm to these local food markets.
Okay, so that makes sense. And so what do you see as sort of, what's is there anything that's holding back these systems right now? Or on the other hand, what's really making a key difference?
It's hard to make these systems work, right? As I said before, right, small and mid-scale farms have higher per unit costs of production. If you're working with beginning farmers, especially those that are truly beginning, right, not multi-generation, there's a lot of barriers to entry. They're not familiar with the suite of government programs to help them. They don't understand about insurance products or about certain kinds of lending opportunities. So there's a lot of sort of education and technical assistance that's needed there. And as you know, right, the food system is operating on very slim margins. So it's difficult to figure out how to make these systems work. There's just no doubt about that. And I think the reason or the argument for these subsidies is that there's some value, some public goods that are derived from having these small and mid-scale farms that make up the vast majority of farms across the United States, right?
I would say that's part of our social contract to some degree. It's hard to measure it, but absolutely.
So, yeah, it's hard to make these systems work, but there's a lot of examples of these opportunities that actually are working. And I can tell you in some of the preliminary research we've done, and most of this is associations and not necessarily causal. We're trying to work out opportunities to do more, experiments as some of these programs are being rolled out. But what we see is that farms that are participating in local food markets, and particularly in intermediated markets, and this is definitely more true of intermediated than direct sale, they're more likely to survive. They're more likely to be profitable, as measured by operating profit margin and net farm income and by ROI, right? So that we do see that they're, especially for beginning and small farms. Now, what's interesting about the association research is that we don't see that advantage once you get over $1 million in gross cash farm income, right? So this is really about small and mid-scale operations.
That makes a lot of sense. And if you think, we've been talking about saving the family farm for decades now, and what a farm looks like has changed over time. But it's interesting because it takes a lot to support a family, like, to have sufficient income where it's can be competitive with sort of non-farm work. And, I think of even my local farmers markets. Most of them, it's something they do on the side. Some of them are very tired doing it on the side. And there's one or two where it's full time, and they're pretty tired. It's like run in any, small business. It's a huge, huge effort. But I guess what are you seeing with where this is, some way that a family can be involved in agriculture as, one part of their income versus it really being able to be a, standalone a business that's big enough to support a family.
Yeah. So, I said I teach farm business management. And also, when I was at Colorado State University, Martha Sullins and Don Thelmany ran the Building Farmer program, and I would teach in that. And one of the really smart things they did that I see also in my class is that so many people get into farming or decide to go back to the family farm because they're really passionate about growing or raising something, right? They love growing broccoli. They love, right, like working with horses. And that's important, right? You need that to be able to sustain the long days and deal with the sort of risk and challenges. What we're trying to get people to do first is to think about this as a business, right? And instead of really going in there and just saying, I love growing broccoli, or I saw that there's a farmer's market around the corner from my house, I'm going to start selling there. It's really thinking about what is the market opportunity, right? And why is this the right market for what I'm trying to do? And so, as I said, I think those direct to consumer markets have lower barriers to entry. It's pretty easy to go and start selling at a farmer's market. But when you're selling at a farmer's market, it's long days, right? Which is substantial labor costs, right? Or even if you're not paying yourself, it's your time and there's opportunity costs associated with that. Um, You're dealing with all of the supply chain issues about getting the product to market, right? There's all of these things about it that are challenging that intermediated markets you may not get as a farmer to retain the whole of that retail dollar, right? But it may be worth that trade-off for having somebody else do some of those supply chain pieces. Now, I work in New York a lot now. In a place like New York City, if you're proximate to New York City and you have an opportunity to sell through something like the green markets, which is the largest network of farmers markets in the world, and there's farmers that are really making substantial income there, right? That might be a market that works, but you might have to think about it of how does it work for your lifestyle? It might be not you selling at that market, but having employees in New York City, right, that can help with that. So I think what we want to do is really start off from this place around what is the market opportunity, putting together a plan that shows that you can do this profitably, incorporating things like your time,
Mhm.
right, and that there's a cost associated with that. But then also thinking about some of those sort of family and lifestyle goals as well. Because obviously that is an important part. We know most producers are not just profit maximizers, and they're making these decisions for lots of reasons around markets.
Have there been studies on the economic impacts of growth of local food markets in some areas?
Yeah, definitely. I've done a bunch of that work. And, we do see that there are positive, outcomes associated with it. I get, and it's part of that literature, I think, in regional economics, the importance of local ownership, of some of the social capital, right, that's generated
Yeah.
through these relationships, right? Because part of why you're getting a premium for these products is about what those relationships are. There's a story I always like to tell about this farmer in Colorado who's a peach grower and fruit grower. And you could go and buy his product at the farmer's market. Now, the farmer's market in Fort Collins was, open on a Saturday for limited hours.
Yeah.
And you could buy the exact same product at the Whole Foods that you could go anytime, right? You could buy it at Whole Foods
Yeah,
with great
yeah.
hours. And if I recall
Right.
correctly, I think that product was actually cheaper if you bought it in the Whole Foods as opposed to going to the farmer's market.
Yeah.
This farmer was always sold out within 2 hours, right? And why? Why were people willing to pay a premium at that farmer's market in this inconvenient time? Because they gain some
Yeah.
kind of benefit, right? They
Yeah.
value that kind of interaction and learning about the
Right.
farm and seeing his face and such, right? And that there's
Right.
spillover effects associated with, I think, those kinds
Yeah.
of interactions
Yeah.
that are a little bit harder to quantify, but that are important. I was part of a study a number of years ago with Todd Schmidt. And one of the things that we also saw when we looked at the New York City green markets is that there were interactions that took place between consumers in New York City and the vendors that gave the vendors new ideas to develop products.
Yeah.
But what was
Yeah.
most interesting about it was it wasn't just ideas that they then developed themselves, but also told their neighbors about, right? So again, these sort of spillover economic benefits in terms of entrepreneurship that are important.
I'd imagine there's some limits to the growth of farmers markets. I go every week because 'cause I'm too lazy to garden and I don't and I like cooking, but but I mean, a lot of my friends, they only have time to go shopping once a week. They go to a local grocery store. For some people, cost is a big issue. So yeah, what's the future for this? Is it mostly an intermediated and, trying to get some of the farms into grocery stores?
That's exactly what I would bet, right? And I think that's exactly what we're starting to see with some of the national data. I mean, what's true is that we have the vast majority of our population that lives in urban areas, and that we have these local food sales that are concentrated in these urban places. So I think what that means is that farmers that have a comparative advantage to sell into these markets are producers that are closer, right? They're farming within an MSA or close to it, right? So they have lower transaction costs associated with getting to those markets. But I think that those intermediated markets, right, that there's a lot of opportunity for growth. I know you mentioned a conversation you had last week around food as medicine, and there's some local prescription programs that are starting to take place. I mean, you look at like Organic Valley, for example, right?
Yeah.
Organic Valley, they have not shown me their numbers, but they even have these locally branded products, right, by state or by region. And I
Right.
assume companies like that aren't going to do it if they don't see value, right, in their bottom line of that level of differentiation. So same thing with those school markets that I was mentioning, right? We're seeing increasing funding that's available at the state level. We're seeing cities participate in the good food purchasing program, right, where the mayors are
Yeah.
actually signing to say that we want to leverage this municipal procurement to achieve a range of different sort of values-based goals. So I think that is going to continue, and I think we're going to see it more and more incentivized through governmental action that happens at local and state levels.
I know we talked about what it takes for a farm. I was wondering if you could, I prefer numbers because I mean, we're economists, but maybe more just in a more descriptive way, like, what it takes to start one of these businesses to not necessarily to, I think, people work two jobs or have different businesses. Does it have to be, what does it take to get a viable business or,
Yeah. Well, it's a hard question,
yeah,
but here's
yeah.
some
Like
advice
just
that
an example is fine, but
here's some
yeah,
advice that I often give out.
yeah.
I think that one is just really trying to understand what the local assets are that you can take advantage of, right? So, do you have co-packers in your region, right? Are there processing or distribution services you can work with? Because one of the challenges with local and regional food systems is, especially when you look at direct markets, is that farmers are not usually good at all aspects of the supply chain, right? They're not
Yeah.
always good at
Yeah.
growing product and marketing product and distributing product, right? They don't have a comparative advantage across all of those different areas. So even though it's attractive to be able to capture the entirety of that retail dollar, actually they have so many additional costs associated with doing that it's not usually a good strategy. So I think it's about really thinking about what is those infrastructure and assets you have at your disposal. What is your comparative advantage, right? Which is something I don't think enough producers really sit and think about, especially when they're starting a new business or a new enterprise. Something we spend a lot of time on in my farm business management class. And then what's the market opportunity, right? Which is, of course, connected to that comparative advantage. But I think you really want to start off and not just say, okay, I love growing broccoli, so that's definitely what I'm going to do. For example, like again, talking about that New York City market, I've talked to some producers who were going to the market and they recognized that there was some product that wasn't there. And so they said, oh, I think I can, grow or raise that, right? I think I can do that. Or it's conversations with your local processor that happens to make a great sausage, right? They're USDA inspected, but their seasoning, their recipe is fantastic, and they can produce it at a quantity for you that's going to make sense to be able to access a new kind of market. Or you have access to a retailer that really has noticed that they have demand for something that they can't get through their other distribution channels, right? So those are the kinds of things that I think are really important on the front end to identify.
What about on sort of the retailer or intermediary side? I could imagine they might not always understand the challenges that farms face.
Yes, it's difficult, right? And I know I've had a lot of calls over the years. This is a little bit different than what you're saying, but like from folks in Silicon Valley, right, who have some kind of what they think is like a tech innovation to solve some kind of issue, but they've never worked on the ag side. And so they don't necessarily understand why there's particular things around agriculture that make this a challenge to address. So, yes, I think it's a challenge, and it's one of the purported benefits of something like a food hub, right? Where you have this sort of mission or values driven type of framework. But that also creates challenges because if you're vision or mission driven, sometimes you're not thinking enough about how to make that business sort of viable once the grants run out. And so it takes sort of that combination, right? Working together. Like I mentioned, there's all these incentives that are coming from schools, but still schools, their fundamental responsibility is to make sure that kids eat, right?
Right.
So there's only, even with some kind of incentive, sometimes you can't make it work to get those local products, right? And I'll give you a quick example about that. In New York State, we've had this incentive in place, I think, for about 8 years now with that 30% initiative. And over the course of those 8 years, you still have less than 10% of all school food authorities that have taken advantage of it, right? Which says either the incentive's not enough or that there's these just persistent barriers in place. And we have this incredible team through Cornell Cooperative Extension that's working to address a lot of these things, but
Yeah.
it's not easy.
Yeah. I could have, I mean, if harvest is 3 weeks, you need to sell it. Maybe you could store it. And then you have a retailer who has I can imagine that takes a while to sort out.
And this is happening at the same time where there's structural changes happening throughout the food system, right? So you have growth in private labeling, you have consolidation of the retail sector and the processing sector, right? I mean, so it's like this, on the one hand, there's this push from state and federal government to sort of rebuild these mid-scale regional supply chains. And at the other hand, there's this push for continued consolidation, continued efficiency, lower costs, improved convenience, right?
And can you, I guess, I think affordability and convenience are always gonna be challenges. How are these being met, right? How are people thinking about this in terms of local foods?
Yeah, I mean, we have a number of programs that are set up specifically to bring these two things together. So, like double up SNAP programs, right? Or the GusNIP program, where what you're trying to do is to say, want the idea behind it, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but the idea behind it is consumers get access to healthier food at a farmer's market type situation, for example. So, but we know that that product can be more expensive, right? There's small farms that have higher cost of production. So if we give low income households additional money to spend on local items, then it's sort of a win-win. But there's really not a lot of studies that are demonstrating the farm level impacts of those kinds of initiatives, right? So there's a lot more research that takes place on the consumer end and the sort of public health type effects or nutrition effects of that. There's very, very little research on the farm side that does that well. We really just don't have a lot of information on what those farm levels. We have anecdotal and we have some small case studies.
So what do you think, and this is, I guess, maybe a little bit different, but what's the upside for development of these markets, given that there's some things you can't produce in some places and that cost inconvenience or and our current system is going to play in. What do you think that the upside is, or what's your vision for what might be possible?
I mean, I think the upside is to create opportunities for small and mid-scale and beginning farmers, right? I think that that's really, if we want small and mid-scale operations and beginning farmers that are not just multi-generation, but where all of the operators are truly beginning, we have to have ways where they can sell product to markets where they get some kind of premium for that. And we know that there is a segment of consumers that are willing to pay a premium for that, right? So that is a win-win. Now, how low income households fit into that, I think, is a question mark,
Yeah.
right? But certainly there's some consumers that are willing to pay a premium. And then I think there's evidence of that some of the benefits are to communities of, again, some of the benefits in terms of social capital, social cohesion, as well as opportunities for entrepreneurship and regional economic development. So I think those are some of the benefits, but I also think sometimes local and regional food systems are promoted as this sort of like silver bullet, which there's not a whole lot of evidence to support, right? And one other thing, Jenny, that's I think a really important point, which is, maybe I've been painting this as sort of these bifurcated systems, but it's actually not true from especially the farm perspective. One of the interesting things we see through the census data is that about 70% of farms that are selling through local food markets also sell through commodity markets. And of those farms that sell through both local food markets and commodity markets, it's actually only 35% of their total sales that are coming from local food markets, right? So the other thing that we can think about local food markets as, I think, is this sort of risk management strategy, right? It's like market diversification.
So, do you think there's some substantial potential for growth?
I think that there's definitely potential for growth. Part of this depends on how we're measuring it, right? How we're defining it and tracking it. So, I mean, that's part of the challenge right now, right? Are we really capturing what is total local food sales right now? I'm not sure if we are. So I do think that there is potential for growth, especially with some of these incentives. And as I said, I think some of these incentives are likely to increase in some places. And it's not just in the US. I mean, I've been doing this work around the world, and you look at the number of cities and countries that are, for example, implementing school meals programs where they're trying to incorporate some of these other values goals. So I think that the market potential globally is pretty significant. Now, this is never going to replace commodity markets, but I think it's going to continue to be a viable opportunity area for especially small and mid-scale operations.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see what happens on the health and nutrition side and how much that can help things grow. So, what do you think are the big unanswered questions? What don't we know right now?
I think there's a lot that we don't know, right? And one of the challenges in this area, as opposed to other areas like affordable housing, right? When we have government programs that go out, we do it with some kind of randomized controlled trial, right? We don't do anything like that in this sector. And it feels like there's such an opportunity here. I think one of the challenges is that we just don't understand what the farm level impacts are of different kinds of markets. And one of the things hopefully I've made clear today is that we can't just talk about local and regional food systems as a whole. There's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of performance across these different types of markets. And I
Mhm.
think we can give better tools to decision makers about why incentivizing or putting money into a particular kind of intervention makes sense given the
Mhm.
assets or the goals, right, of that place.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more work that really needs to happen to understand that, especially to think about farm level effects.
So, what's one thing that you're somewhat pessimistic about this movement right now, and what's one thing that you're optimistic about?
So, in terms of pessimistic, I think that there are a lot of well intentioned people that start interventions that actually have these sort of negative outcomes associated with them. And I can give you a few reasons why. Let's say that you start some kind of new market incentive program, right? But you have funding to do it for like only a short period of time. You can imagine farmers then develop and invest in businesses to support that. And then you have no money left and it's gone, right? Or we have a lot of philanthropic investment, right? With because maybe there's less of a process that happens in some of those investments, they actually fund something that puts a private sector business that's doing something good out of business, right? Because there's just not enough demand for both of those businesses to be there. So that's those are some of the things that I'm concerned about right now. And I also think it's like, how do we get better information to producers to support decision making? Because if you think about the data, right, that is made publicly available at the commodity sectors, it's so much harder to do that in terms of some of these local and regional food markets, right?
And it's bad enough for commodities. I mean, I can imagine.
So it's hard, right, about
Yeah.
how producers are making some of these decisions. And then
Right.
also markets that maybe have been there for a long time, right? Like if you
Yeah.
think about some of the retail markets that traditionally vegetable growers that are close to it, right, may have sold into, as we have continued
Yeah.
consolidation, there may be less regional buying that occurs, right? And what happens, that's if farmers start to lose some of those markets,
Yeah.
that can represent significant loss. And I think one of the
Right.
challenges that's happening is that there's maybe a lot of local washing that happens. If you think about it, you go into a grocery store and you see the big
Yeah.
posters
Yeah.
of certain farmers up there, but
Yeah.
maybe there's minimal purchasing from those farms, but the farmers don't
Yeah.
necessarily have the power, right, and those relationships to go in and
Yep.
say, hey, you're not really buying from me. Can you take my picture down?
Gosh.
Right? So as a
That would
consumer,
terrify most farmers that I know.
right?
Terrify them.
So I think those are all hard things. And then also just in terms of there's continued additional regulations, right, that are being put on the farm sector. Some of those
Yep.
are like regulations that are happening by federal actors, but some of those are regulations that are happening or sort of the rules of requirements that are happening by shareholders, right? If they're trying to
Yeah.
track progress towards sustainable development goals, for example. And part of
Yeah.
that becomes the cost of doing business for farmers rather than some kind of premium that they
Yeah.
get, which again serves to mean that it's more expensive to
Mhm.
do business, which means that you need to get bigger to be able to, you know,
Right.
actually afford to cover some of those costs.
Right. 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 But you're optimistic about some things too, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm very optimistic about what the possibilities are. I think that especially around intermediated markets that there's a lot of potential for growth and to support viable farms into the future that are small and mid scale.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you could make one policy happen, what would that be?
Well, that's such a good question. One policy would change. We do not have data to support this yet, but would like to do it. Anecdotally, we heard a lot of really good things about the local food purchasing assistant program that was a pandemic era program that was then
Mhm.
discontinued. And I
Yeah.
mentioned how we don't have a lot of impacts data on like some of the double up SNAP programs, for example, but
Yeah.
anecdotally, we heard a lot of good things about that program. And I would love to see something like that rolled out, but with
Mhm.
funding at the front end to allow us to think about implementing some kind of experiment to really
Yeah.
understand it rigorously. And we have other
Absolutely.
issues around insurance, where we have very low uptake of,
Yeah.
of certain types of insurance products like whole farm revenue
Right.
protection.
Right.
We also see that small farms are much less likely to participate in some of these insurance
Yeah.
programs. right? Making sure that beginning farmers are aware of some of these federal programs that are
Right.
available to them, which I think was the goal of the regional food business
Right.
centers. So there's a
Right.
lot of things that could happen, but maybe it's
Yeah.
not as much of like new policies or programs as tweaks to existing ones.
New policies are hard to do. If you're starting from scratch, you might not have the current set of policies, but you got to work within the system a lot of the time. So I understand that. Well, anything else that I didn't ask that you'd like to cover?
No, thanks for the opportunity. This was really
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it's to be continued.
Yes.
You have to check in fairly frequently. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.